Good evening and welcome.
Wow.
A word about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech and civil discourse are bedrock principles to Harvard Divinity School, the university, and our democracy. With that in mind, I would ask the audience members to refrain from interrupting tonight's lecture and panel discussion. While I understand that you may have a difference of opinion, I would ask that you respect our speakers' right to free speech, as well as the rights of the audience members to listen to tonight's speakers. If you can't respect these guidelines, I will ask for Harvard University Police to remove you. Please turn off your cell phones and pagers. Thank you. Hello, my name is Cheryl Giles. I'm the moderator for tonight's panel. We're delighted that all of you are here and hope that we have a lively conversation about a very timely subject. Our conversation this evening is about the juxtaposition between queer youth and religion. It is a conversation made more poignant by the recent deaths of 15-year-old Billy Lucas, a high school student in Greensburg, Indiana, and 18-year-old Tyler Clementi, a student at Rutgers University. Both were queer, both committed suicide, and both were victims of bullying or cyberbullying. What do these tragedies mandate, and what is the role of religion here? I'd like to say a word or two about the format. We will begin with some opening remarks from Mark Jordan, followed by a response from each of the panelists, and then discussion among the panelists. Finally, we will have time for questions and comments from the audience. And I ask during the Q&A, if you have questions, that about 6 or 8 people line up in the aisles to ask questions, and when you reach that number, that you just wait until the line shortens. Mark Jordan is the Richard Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School. His interests include Christian ethics of sex and gender, the limits of religious language, the rhetoric of theology, and the ritual creation of religious identities. His books include The Invention of Sodomy in Christian Theology, published in 1997. He was the winner of the 1999 John Boswell Prize for Lesbian and Gay History. Another book, The Ethics of Sex, in 2002. And another book, Telling Truths in Church, Scandal, Flesh, and Christian Speech, published in 2003. Finally, his last book was written in 2006 and edited with Virginia Burris and Carmen McKendrick, entitled Rewritten Theology, Aquinas After His Readers. Mark is currently working on a new book on the rhetoric of American church controversies over homosexuality, and this will come out early in 2011. He has won numerous awards for his teaching and research, including a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. Harry Knox is the director of the Human Rights Campaign Religion and Faith Program. Harry joined the staff of the Human Rights Campaign in July 2005. Under his leadership, the Religion and Faith Program has seen the creation of a national speakers bureau that reaches more than 10 million Americans monthly. In addition, the Religion and Faith Program provides scriptural commentary to ministers and lay people interested in ecumenical, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender perspectives on the Bible. Harry has also been instrumental in creating a national network for 22 progressive state clergy coalitions around the country. He has been featured on programs as diverse as The Michael Meadved Show, the BBC, PBS, NBC, CBS, and national and local newspapers. Harry is a former licensed pastor of a United Methodist Church in Georgia. Welcome. Grace Sterling Stowell is the executive director of the Boston Alliance of Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Youth, also known as Bagley in Boston. Grace has been an activist and leader for social justice, particularly in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth communities. She currently serves as vice chairman of the Mass Commission of GLBT Youth and co-chairman of the Legislative Committee of the Mass Transgender Political Coalition. Grace is a nationally known speaker, consultant, and trainer on the needs and issues facing transgender youth and young adults. In 2009, on the 40th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, Grace was one of 40 transgender individuals honored by the International Court Council and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Stonewall Heroes 40. In 2010, she was awarded the Sue J. Hyde Activism Award for longevity in the movement with more than 35 years of dedicated service to justice for LGBT communities. Reverend Irene Monroe is a religion columnist, public theologian, and national speaker. As an African-American feminist theologian, Irene speaks for a sector of society that is frequently invisible. Irene is a sought-after speaker, preacher, and writer about women's spirituality and gender issues. She is a syndicated queer religion columnist and pens a bi-weekly column, The Religion Thang, for In News Weekly, and a monthly online column, Queer Take, for the Witness magazine, an Episcopal journal. Additionally, Irene writes a spirituality column for Rise magazine, a magazine for people of African descent. Irene was a 2002 guest columnist for Open Hands, a religious queer magazine, and she has written columns for Venus magazine. Her writings have appeared in The Advocate and the Boston Globe. Irene is the coordinator of the African American Roundtable of the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies in Religion and Ministry at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. Pam Garramone is Executive Director of Greater Boston Parents, Family, and Friends of Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual and Transgender People, in other words, PFLAG. Pam has taught elementary school and designed and presented personal development workshops. As Executive Director, she directs the Safe Schools and Communities program. Each year, PFLAG delivers over 200 educational programs in Massachusetts middle and high schools, in corporate communities and religious organizations. Pam has been awarded the Gay Officers Action League Community Service Award, the Greater Boston Business Council Individual Award for Excellence, and the Grace Sterling Stowell Award for Excellence in Advocacy and Service to GLBT Youth. Pam was featured in Boston Spirit magazine's cover, Gay and Lesbian People Who Are Making a Difference. That's right. Welcome you all.
Thank you all for coming out tonight, as they used to say at the Flirtations concerts. It is unexpectedly hard to begin. When we started planning this event a year ago, we had no idea how urgent its topic would seem tonight. We felt that the topic was important, that's why we teach and write about it and work for it, but we didn't quite know how it would weigh on us tonight. On September 23rd, the columnist Dan Savage wrote about a queer teen suicide. He expressed the anguished frustration so many of us feel at not being able to say that a miserable adolescence can be followed by a fabulous queer adulthood. Savage wrote, "Gay adults aren't allowed to talk to these kids. Schools and churches don't bring us in to talk to teenagers who are being bullied. Many of these kids have homophobic parents who believe that they can prevent their gay children from growing up to be gay or from ever coming out by depriving them of information, resources, and positive role models. I add, in too many cases, they justify their cruelties with religion." Savage was writing in response to the news about Billy Lucas, 15 years old, who hanged himself in Greensburg, Indiana, dying 8 days later. Savage didn't know when he published the column that Tyler Clementi, 18, the Rutgers freshman, had jumped from the George Washington Bridge the day before, the latest on a long list of recently reported queer suicides. We know that the names we do hear must stand as well for many more that we never will. Perhaps we know, too, that our own names could so easily have been on such a list. Like Dan Savage, I want to spread the word that life gets better, but most of all, I want to help to make it better now. I don't want to abandon queer youth to bullies, especially bullies who invoke religious authority. Instead, I want to neutralize the most hateful religious speech, and then to work with concerned religious organizations to provide queer religious role models and actual places of religious welcome. Religions retain immense power to model human lives, and some queer kids still seek out religious organizations as relatively safe havens, as places safer at least than home. And if some of you are troubled or confused by the use of the word queer, let me explain that many of us use it to mean anyone and everyone who doesn't identify as simply heterosexual, which is a lot of us. So here's my piece for tonight. For a few years now, I've been writing about how American churches debate over homosexuality around adolescence. Since I'm Christian, I work primarily on Christian materials, though I hope some of my conclusions will find analogies in other traditions. A lot has changed over the last 60 years in church debates, but one thing that hasn't is that the young are regularly talked about, but almost never allowed to speak for themselves. Queer youth are at once featured and erased, or displaced, by simplistic views of them. And the fights about them often try to claim them for one camp or another, either religious or queer, but rarely both. So the debates keep cycling, powered by these unchallenged habits of speech. School teacher that I am, I hope that understanding some history will show us how to redirect the debates, or at least to find more effective ways to help queer youth resist religious assaults. Let me tell you 3 short historical stories and then draw quick lessons from them, trusting that my colleagues, my friends, will have much else to say. First story. In 1962, Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco's Tenderloin decided to create an urban center. For those of you who don't know San Francisco, the Tenderloin was, and in some ways still is, a poor, tough neighborhood into which differently marginalized people are herded by economics and by public policy. The church brought in 3 young ministers to run its outreach to the surrounding neighborhoods, which included many of the gay bars and cruising areas. One of the ministers, Ted McIlvaina, had a quick change of heart about homosexuality after he was called in to help a young man who had been beaten by the police and then refused treatment at a local hospital. The hospital didn't want to interfere with the administration of justice. So McIlvaina began to minister to young gays on the street. Through them, he established contacts with the city's lesbian and gay organizations, with the homophile organizations, as they call themselves. One thing that does change in the debates is the basic terminology, the names, which change very rapidly, and none of which have any real basis in Christian scripture. Note that these first contacts between the churches and the queer world in San Francisco are being made through and because of young queers. This happened in many other American cities as well. By 1964, McIlvaina was planning for a consultation on religion and the homosexual that would gather national and local Protestant leaders to meet with representatives of homophile organizations. McIlvaina could rely on his own contacts for church leaders, but for invitations to the homophile side, he turned to Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. Martin and Lyon were among the original founders of the lesbian organization, the Daughters of Bilitis, and its magazine, The Ladder. They insisted to McIlvaina that he must include some women in the conversation, and from the homophile side, since women were evidently not going to be well represented among the Christian clergy. The consultation convened at the end of May 1964. I pick out only one piece of its discussions. In a summary of small group sessions, Del Martin reported deep concern for the plight of the homophile teenager. Since the homophile organizations may not legally deal with minors, the group proposed that an educational program be started so that clergymen at the parish level could deal knowledgeably with teenage homosexuals. The homophile groups are here pleading with the clergy to take care of queer youth because they can't. The consultation resulted in the founding of a long-running national group, the Council on Religion and the Homosexual. I want to underscore the problem Del Martin is describing from a single incident at a council meeting in March 1965. According to the diary of one participant, and I quote, "A 19-year-old girl came to the meeting with Phyllis Lyon. She is wanting a group of young lesbians organized. She was told that can't be done, as a sponsoring adult would lay themselves open to criminal charges of contributing to the delinquency of a minor." Homophile activists are afraid to reach out to young queers. Their stated reason is the threat of criminal prosecution, and this is a real reason. I never mean to forget the legal sanctions under which queer communities have had to survive. But it is not hard to hear in the archives from these years a mix of other fears, many of which still move us, long after the threat of legal prosecution has diminished. For example, some people feared and still fear that any involvement with youth will harm political progress by confirming the worst things said about homosexuals, namely that we are all pedophiles. At other times, the motive for neglecting the young is a kind of shame about one's own difficult youth, a refusal to go back to that embarrassing, painful place. How many of us, having escaped a queer adolescence, want to forget all about it? Which brings me to my first lesson. We cannot help the young if we deny them. For a variety of legal, social, and psychological reasons, LGBT communities have historically cut themselves off from regular contact with queer youth. Many of our institutions, especially our social spaces, were constructed precisely to exclude the young for legal reasons. At a minimum, we should be concerned with what that says to them about who does and who does not care for them. But I think we must go further. We must actively support institutions that can reach queer youth. The basic fact of queer childhood and adolescence, the condition of our tenuous history, is that most homosexual kids are raised by heterosexual parents. Queer identity, queer lore, queer faith passes down most often outside the home through other institutions, including churches. My second story is about Anita Bryant and the Save Our Children campaign. For those of you too young to have grown up with her, Anita, as she liked to be called, Anita was a former beauty queen who became a pop singer in the 1950s meaning of the term. Her recorded repertoire ranged from lounge favorites through patriotic standards to evangelical hymns. But she was best known for her singing commercials, first with Coca-Cola and then with the Florida Citrus Commission. Some of us still hear in our nightmares the jingle, "Come to the Florida Sunshine Tree." I could even sing it for you, but... In December 1976, the Dade County Metro Commission passed unanimously on first reading an ordinance banning discrimination in employment and housing on the basis of affectional or sexual preference. After the non-discrimination ordinance passed, a local attorney, Robert Brake, decided that it would force local churches and their schools to hire avowed homosexuals. Brake began to use political and church networks to organize a petition drive that would compel the commission to back down. When the ordinance came back for a second reading and what was presumed to be automatic passage, the noisy commission meeting was filled with self-proclaimed Christian protesters, including Anita Bryant, who had been recruited to lead the new campaign by her pastor. Despite audience protest, the ordinance was approved again. So the petitions to repeal were circulated in earnest, especially through churches. Faced with the petitions, the county commission decided it would put the question to popular vote rather than to repeal the ordinance. The ensuing campaign drew national attention and organizational support for both sides. In its last weeks, Anita appeared frequently, including in a debate at the Kiwanis Club, where she once again sang the battle hymn of the Republic, which by that time had become an anti-gay anthem somehow. On June 7th, the Miami-Dade non-discrimination ordinance was overturned decisively by almost 70% of those voting. At the Victory News Conference, Bryant intoned, "Tonight the laws of God and the cultural values of man have been vindicated." Let me freeze on that frame. Remember that the name for Bryant's campaign was Save Our Children. Its prime exhibits included lurid newspaper headlines about gay child molesters. It predicted that school children would be forced to acknowledge homosexuality as a valid lifestyle, exactly the scare tactic used 2 years ago in California's Proposition 8 campaign. Throughout her campaign, Bryant presented herself not as a political spokesperson, but as a concerned Christian mother. As a mother, she says things like, "If my children are exposed to homosexuality, I might as well feed them garbage." As a self-proclaimed Christian mother, she repeats that all religious people, and especially all true Christians, must proclaim God's absolute opposition to homosexuality. When Anita is confronted with Christians who disagree with her, she accuses them of ignoring the plain meaning of the Bible, or abandoning Christianity for secular doctrines, or of being agents of demonic power, or all three. Bryant's rhetoric works by confusing two really different things, homosexuality and violent sexual abuse, but also by segregating two things that often go together, being Christian and being queer. She also pretends, another bold lie, that no children or adolescents are queer unless some pervert infects them. Second lesson, we can never allow religion and queer to be presented as strict opposites. This opposition endangers all queer people, but especially the young, who are, because of parental authority or peer pressure, often at the mercy of the most punishing religious systems. They need religious resources to fight back. Bryant had obvious reasons for insisting on the opposition between religious and queer. Some LGBT adults end up agreeing with her because of their painful religious upbringings. For too many of us, things get better because we go into exile, because we walk away from the families and towns and churches that have wounded us. But when you walk away, you leave the young behind you. If I can borrow evidence from the great authority on American adolescence, I mean Glee. Yeah. When you walk away, you leave young queers like Kurt, thinking that God makes me gay and then makes his followers go around saying it's a choice, as if I'd choose to be mocked every day of my life. His followers. That's the continuing victory of Anita Bryant, but that's also conceding her victory. So whether you are now religious or not, a commitment to help queer youth means a commitment to support progressive religious projects that might be able to reach them, both with antidotes to what they are being taught and with alternative models of religious life that include queer people as full members. Let me repeat this lesson because I know that it's likely to be controversial. It goes against a liberal assumption that religion is a private conviction that should be respected by keeping politely silent about it. That assumption reinforces Bryant's basic rhetorical strategy by making it seem that liberal voices have nothing to say about religion. We cannot keep silent about religion for a host of reasons, including rhetorical effectiveness. One thing we could have learned from Bryant's victory, but apparently didn't learn in time for the Prop 8 campaign, is that the language of tolerance is typically not strong enough to counteract religious language. That's partly because of the rhetorical dirty tricks that some religious speakers are willing to play, but mostly because religious rhetoric presents deeply appealing hopes for the possible futures of human life in community. Prophetic and messianic images move us in ways that the procedural language of tolerance and legal rights often doesn't. So we need to counter religious attacks on our sexuality with religious defenses of our sexuality. That will require making religious stories and ritual communities that shape queer lives. Fortunately, we are now getting religious resources for doing just this. My third story is about a suicide that didn't happen. In 2005, the blog entries of a gay teenager in Tennessee, circulated urgently by his friends, attracted a news swarm. Zach Stark was then a 16-year-old high school student who had recently come out as gay to his Christian parents. He wrote, "They tell me that there is something psychologically wrong with me, and they raised me wrong. I'm a big screw-up to them, who isn't on the path God wants me to be on." In response, so Zach's blog reported, they were forcing him to enroll in a religious treatment program called Refuge. Facing this news, Zach worried about responding melodramatically before typing out thoughts of suicide and thwarted rage. Refuge was then a program aimed by Memphis-based Love in Action International at 13 to 17-year-olds. It advertised itself as the most developed, intensive program in America for youth struggling with homosexuality. In plain English, an ex-gay program for often unwilling teens. According to published reports, participants spent their days at Refuge studying the Bible, undergoing what was called counseling, and confessing their temptations. They were forbidden to watch television or read anything unapproved. Throughout the day, they monitored each other for campy actions or gay lesbian behavior and talk. While Zach was still in the program, his father defended the decision to enroll him by denouncing the homosexual lifestyle on Christian television and appealing to parental authority. He told Pat Robertson's CBN, "Until he turns 18 and he's an adult in the state of Tennessee, I'm responsible for him, and I'm going to see to it that he has all the options available to him, except, of course, the option of not submitting to an abusive religious treatment." The state of Tennessee had other worries. Media complaints led it to investigate Love in Action for operating an unlicensed medical facility. The ministry retracted some of its claims about therapy, then countersued the state. Zach survived the program and retreated into privacy. He has said very little about his life since, that he is apparently living happily. While respecting his privacy, we can draw a third lesson from his story. One lesson could be about using a mixture of strategies. I have no doubt that the public protests and major media reports pushed Love in Action and other so-called ministries to change their programs. It was also important to keep stripping away the pseudo-scientific pretensions of ex-gay therapies, not least by bringing professional and governmental agencies to bear on them. If some people want to fuse their interpretation of the gospel with discredited, damaging psychological theories, we can resist their religious claims by undoing their alleged science. But the lesson I most want to learn from Zach's story is how to get helpful words to queer youth in his situation, including words about other Christianities, about Christian communities that could have helped him to defend himself against religious abuse while offering him hope for a queer religious future, if that's what he wants. Homophobic Christian discourses damage all queer youth in this country, but they are especially damaging to queer youth in Christian homes, and worst, for youth who believe. Helping queer youth can't mean just helping queer secular youth. Here we need to do more work. Some of it is sociological and psychological research, because much of the available research on queer youth still views religion mainly as a threat or risk factor. But I have to leave that research to others. What I can see more clearly are the religious needs, and specifically the Christian ones. In dealing with queer Christian youth, we have to move beyond tolerance or acceptance, even in progressive churches, to provide positive resources for growing up queer. It is not enough for a church to say, go figure out your sexual identity somewhere else, then come back so that we can accept you as a fully formed queer person. That again concedes Bryant's basic premise, while abandoning someone like Zach to versions of Christianity that are all too eager to reshape his sexuality against his will. Progressive churches have to be able to say, we will help you grow into your sexuality here, even as we help you grow into your spirituality. which means that churches need something convincing to say about the relation of queer sexuality to spirituality. I'm talking about queer youth, but of course churches need to figure this out for everyone, queer and not, young and not. And I'm talking about churches, but I would put the same challenge to other religious traditions. If we want to speak words of consolation to adolescents in Zach's situation, we have to be able to talk religion. We have to persuade them first that they are not divinely condemned. Then we have to show them that they don't have to cut out their deepest religious desires in order to be queer. For some adolescents, cutting out religion is a relief. They never believed anyway and have better uses for Sunday morning. For others, cutting out religious aspirations is a terrifying prospect. It increases their suffering because they imagine that they are abandoned not just by parents and friends, but by religious community and even by God. We have to get them better news about God. We have to present them with convincing pictures of their own queer futures as believers. We have to open for them actual spaces in which they can be queer and religious. Exile from religion cannot be the cost of admission to queer life, especially for the young. Thank you.
Just go. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello. So if Anita Bryant believes that we're all heterosexual until some pervert turns us homosexual in childhood, I have to blame Farrah Fawcett. Because growing up in that decade, I was totally in love with Farrah. All my friends wanted to look like her, you know, remember that blonde feathered look? And I wanted to be with her. So I think she's the pervert, I guess, that turned me. I want to thank you, Cheryl, for putting this panel together and for us to be here to have this conversation. It's happening again in other colleges. I think this is one of the most important topics and conversations that we can have today. Right now at Pine Manor College tonight, they're doing rainbows in religion. Boston College did a similar one where they showed where the Bible tells me so. For the Bible tells me so. So I think it's amazing that this conversation is happening. And, you know, when we go into schools and do forums like this and people ask me, how do you reconcile homosexuality with the Bible? I always kind of jokingly say that we didn't make the 10 Commandments. There's no commandment that says thou shalt not be gay. You can test, I don't know if that's true. I think it's true.
You're good.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm Catholic. We don't really read the Bible. We just, But it does say, I think one of the commandments is, thou shalt not commit adultery, and millions of Americans commit adultery every day. In fact, I think you don't even have to do it, you just have to think about it, and you've done it, right? So where is the outcry around adultery when that is a commandment? That's what I kind of always say, you know, why is it that gay people are the one sort of sin that's the worst of all, and that we're banned from churches, we're banned from having this conversation? It just seems crazy to me. So what I want to talk a little bit about is what PFLAG does around religious issues and other issues. And to start with the two main things that we do, one is support. So we have 10 support groups in the greater Boston area for parents who one day have a kid come up to them and say, Mom, Dad, I'm gay. And those parents then, the best thing they can do, and we have some PFLAG parents here, is to go to a PFLAG meeting. For some parents it takes years, for some they're on the phone the next day, where's the nearest meeting? With Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up, it's our busy time of year because the gays love to ruin the holidays. Coming out at Thanksgiving, and we're very, very busy. So the parents call us, and honestly, if you know any parents who are struggling, the best thing you can do is introduce them to another parent through PFLAG to either meet in our support group. We have one-to-one where parents, we match a gay dad with a gay son with another dad with a gay son. They can go have coffee, and we we have a helpline. And really that's the fastest way to get them from rejecting or ambivalent to accepting and being an advocate. It's the fastest way. It's better than going to their pastor, I believe. And so I want to also just share with you that Dr. Caitlin Ryan has just put out the latest research saying that males and females have a sexual awareness by age 10. So while, and even before that for most males, if you're a gay male, you might say, I knew when I was 4, 5, and 6 years old, right? Okay. So, and you're not alone, because most gay men will say that. So while we're growing up, myself included, as a Catholic, we're going to church, we're hearing the messages of our parents, and I really believe that the churches are teaching us to hate ourselves by what they're saying, even if they're not blatantly saying it, as they do in many churches. Even if it's subtle, we get the message that it's not okay to be who you are. I certainly got that message not just from being in the Catholic Church, but also from my parents, who unknowingly would say things like, oh, you know, Pam's got a boyfriend. I was in first grade. You know, Pam's got a boyfriend. Isn't that adorable? And you know, parents even in kindergarten, isn't it cute? Johnny likes Susie. Right? Raise your hand if you still hear this from parents. Or isn't it adorable that Ronnie loves or likes or kissed Susie, whatever it is, right? So even in very young ages, parents are never considering that they might have a gay kid. Doesn't even cross their mind, but at the same time, their kid is thinking, I might be gay. And it might not be those words, but they're starting to realize they're not like all the other kids. So Caitlin Ryan found that parents fell into 4 distinct categories, and the first one is rejecting. And she found that 30% of parents reject their child. This is recent research, okay? So 30% of parents say, when they find out they have a gay kid, get out. You're no longer my child. Bye. 50% of parents fell into a category she calls ambivalent. And ambivalent is, I love you, but. I love you, but don't tell anyone else. I love you, but I don't want to see it. You're not bringing your boyfriend or girlfriend home. You're not going to the Gay Straight Alliance. You know, I love you, but I just don't want to see it or hear about it. Okay? So that's 80% right there, are either rejecting or ambivalent. 17% of parents fell into a category called accepting. And that sounds like this: I love you. I think those are the UCCs, I'm not sure. And then she found a surprising 4th category of parents. 3% of parents fell into a category called celebratory. When they found out they had a gay kid, they were like, yes, it's a gift from God. Now I can march with PFLAG and Pride. And I think those are the UUs. What do you think? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But what she also found is that may be where parents start, but they can move and shift into other categories. And the way they move from rejecting to accepting is by getting educated, by talking to other parents, by questioning what they hear in the churches. And I think one of the biggest things that's shifting in the whole religious and homosexuality is when a gay kid comes out in a Christian family and that parent starts to question everything they've been told. And I do have a quick story about a student here at Harvard a few years ago who spoke in our Speakers Bureau, and he grew up in rural Tennessee. And when he was a little kid, his parents were grooming him to be a Baptist minister because he was very charismatic, very articulate, very outgoing. Even as a young child, they were like, he's the next religious leader. So all through his life, everything's religious, I guess, in the evangelical and other religious communities. Like everything you do, your social life is around the church, not just Sunday church like me, Catholic. So he was groomed to be it, and at the same time, he was learning inside that he wasn't straight, but hearing all this stuff so it was a struggle. And finally, he told his parents right before he went to college that he was gay, and his mother was in the rejecting category, 100% rejecting. And she would say horrendous things, and I'm going to say this because he says it in his story, and it's revolting, but this was one of the things that she said among many other revolting things. You mean you would give all this up to have a dick up your ass?
Oh, my Lord.
And and he said that was just one of many revolting things she would say to him. And finally he said, after probably a year of putting up with this kind of language, he said, Mom, if you cannot treat me with respect and accept me for who I am, then don't talk to me. He came here to Harvard as a freshman. They did not talk for 2 years because every time she started in on the religious and this and that, he hung up and said, I'm not going to listen to this. But, so she started out in rejecting, but over time, and it took the 4 years here at Harvard, he met a guy at a Western sort of dance that was going on here with big belt buckles and boots and so forth. He met this guy, their eyes met across a crowded room. They fell in love, and when they graduated in June, they had a big gay wedding on the Harvard campus, and the mother was at that wedding. And it doesn't just happen, though. They have to meet other parents, they have to get educated, and they have to just realize that the love of their child is more important than the stuff they hear in the church. Okay, so they can move and shift. And if the rejecting and ambivalent kids, those parents, the kids of those parents are at the highest risk for suicide. 8 times more likely to attempt suicide if you have a parent who rejects you. Substance abuse, all of the statistics, HIV, are much higher when your family rejects you, when your parents reject you. So it's the church is incredibly important, and the parent piece, where do these parents get the idea that it's not okay for their kid to be gay? Where do they get it? Predominantly. Say it. In the church, right? So we really have to focus not just on the church, but the messages the parents are getting and they're relaying to their children. If we can shift that message, and if parents can realize they can keep their faith, but still love their kid and support their kid. You don't have to give up your religion, that you can still have that and still support your child and love your child. Then when kids have parents who are accepting, all of the risk behaviors are significantly reduced. In fact, 92%, according to Caitlin Ryan, believe they will live a happy, healthy life and get married and have children themselves. Yeah, so we need to really work on the parents. And I want to also talk a little bit about the education piece, because we do go into middle and high schools all over the state, and we do get the religious questions. Students will say, you know, what do you think of, what about Sodom and Gomorrah? The first time I heard that, I didn't read the Bible. I had no idea of that story. I didn't know a thing about it. So I basically said what I think I read in your paper was, I believe God doesn't make mistakes. And I think he did a pretty good job with me. I mean, there's a few things probably could have did a little better, but pretty much happy. I'm good, okay.
We're going to need to move on in a minute.
Okay, so anyway, I think with the schools and the parent piece, where parents when they don't want us to go into the schools, it's what you had said about the fear that if we talk about this and we make it seem normal, then my kid will think it's okay and will be more likely to choose to be gay. That's really the underlying fear around parents. And I want to just close with a quick story about a gentleman. When gay marriage became legal in Massachusetts, I was at Bunker Hill Community College when we got the news. I was in a small group with straight people as a participant, and I heard it, and I just said, before we do this assignment, I just got to say, today, my life has changed forever. I can get married, and for you in this group, nothing has changed for you. Your life hasn't changed at all. And this guy from the Dominican Republic said, you're wrong. I'm Catholic, and I have 2 small boys. One is 5 and one is 7. And if you can get married, then my little boys are going to think that's okay, and they'll be more likely to choose to be gay. And I said to him, that's really interesting, because when I was growing up, there were no images of gay people. I never saw a gay couple. We weren't on TV back then, and I never heard anything about it, and I'm gay. And he looked at me and he went, huh. And that's it. And I don't know if that changed anything, but my call to action to all of us here, if we're gay, we need to be visible. We need to say, I'm gay, and have that conversation with that guy from the Dominican Republic, with everyone, anyone. And if you're straight, you need to have the conversation, you need to be visible, to stop other people from making the gay jokes, to say, my friend is gay, my kid is gay. We all need to be more as loud as the Christian right, and standing up for ourselves and the people we know who are gay. So thank you.
Thank you. If you want,
I'm told to talk to you for 10 minutes. It's very, very hard when you come out of that Baptist tradition and you get heated and hot while you're talking. But I'm going to try to be as brief as possible here and stuff. I need to say first that coming out of the African American church experience, we have sort of different issues to deal with. Racism certainly is one of them, but we don't have a gay ghetto. And we don't have a widespread of black PFLAGs. I do think that if indeed we had at least a black chapter PFLAG, a number of them, I know that here in Boston they were trying to resurrect one, and it sort of ebbs and flows. But I do think that if indeed we had some black chapters of PFLAG, it would tamp down the vitriol that you hear out of Bishop Eddie Long. We can signify on that one today, and certainly Donnie McClurkin. But I need to say just very briefly that really for me the personal is political. Once upon a time I too was a youth, and then at one point I had this call to go to seminary. And one of the things I have about seminary, because someone asked me, so Irene, why do you want to go to seminary? And I said, well, I could sum it up like this. Some are called, some are sent, and some just went. And since I'm just going here, I figured, particularly having graduated from Wellesley, an all-white school, predominantly white now today, that in wanting to go to do seminary, it seemed to me that it would behoove me to go to a black seminary, because who best could talk about the black church other than a black seminary? But lo and behold, I applied to ITC, which is Interdenominational Theological Seminary. It's been such a long time, and Howard. These are the only two, I think, in the country. And I got rejected. And you know how that is when you get your rejection notice. You hit the floor and I got rejected, all of that. And I thought, that was a denunciation by God. But I got a call from a woman at ITC who said to me, she wanted me to know that my application in terms of academically was very strong, and it really was one of the top applications coming in. And so, of course, what I thought was, well, hot dog, more financial aid, because that's truly what I was asking for. But my faith statement was very problematic. I talked about being Paul. I was like Apostle Paul, had a thorn in my side, and my thorn was hiding my sexuality. But in any event, to make a long story short, she said to me that I was provisional at this point because the committee couldn't make a decision yet, and that she wanted me to know that, number one, there weren't any homosexuals at ITC. And so I said to her, being terribly nervous, I said to her, well, at one point there were no women at ITC, but now you have women going into the ministry. And I said, I don't mind being your demo dyke, because my radar will definitely let me know if I'm the only one, But she didn't find it. I'm delighted that you folks find it funny, but she didn't. And of course, I'm on the phone and I got nervous and stuff. But the long and short of it was that her statement to me was this: if if they accept me to ITC, I would have to make this commitment to stay closeted, to not recruit, and that I needed, not to. And she wanted me to know this, that if I came out gay, and certainly made other folks gay, that I would be expelled. And that I needed to understand also that I couldn't come down there being gay because I needed to understand that when you're in an MDiv program, that there would be no church in Atlanta that would take me. And I said, well, what about King's Church? What about King's Church? I said, this is the bedrock of the civil rights movement. I said, this is a civil rights issue. And she said to me, sister, please, okay? So, but in any event, I made a decision that I would not be closeted. And so within a week to 10 days, I got my rejection notice. And so I ended up, not by choice, but I'm glad I went. I went to Union Theological Seminary and pastored. I was pastoring a church first, black Presbyterian churches I pastored, one in the Bronx and then one certainly in New Jersey. And what I saw there was that when the AIDS epidemic was happening, the black folks called it consumption. I got 5 minutes?
That's right. I was just going to say you're warming up, but...
I got to get going? Okay. Yeah, okay. And they didn't call it AIDS. Black folks call it consumption. But the point about it is that we saw black teens infected with it before the CDC came out with it. Long before the CDC talked about black women being infected with the AIDS virus, I saw my girlfriends dying because of brothers on the down low, because of just not ample information about how this disease was moving through and throughout the African American community. When I got here to Harvard, I remember the dean calling me in and asking me, because at that time I was writing in Newsweekly this column called The Religion Thing. And now within Newsweekly having folded, I write, Bay Windows has picked me up. But I remember the dean calling me in and saying to me, Irene, what are you doing here? Because this is not what you're doing, it's called academic writing. I said, well, I'm certainly engaging in dissertation avoidance behavior, but I have to think creatively how to reach my community, when I came up here to start the doctoral program, I was sent to Roxbury Presbyterian Church, an all-black church, and I was quite excited about that. But I was too gay, I talked too much about sexuality, social justice issues, and they said, we got to get rid of her. And they did. And so there I was with no church, but having a need to minister. And so I had to think of a different way of how do you reach this audience, because they're not at Harvard Divinity School, as quietly as it kept and as I look through here, the audience, but they also are not in the church. And if they are, they're closeted. And so one of the vehicles that I could best reach a population of people is, where are the folks? Well, the folks, if they were in New York, I know where they are. But one of the things I learned here is that folks at the time and a younger audience read what I call the gay rags. And so that started me picking up the pen here. One of the pieces I wrote, I know I have a few minutes left and stuff, but I had to begin to think about how do we save all youth, but particularly black youth. And so I wrote a piece here called Breaking the Black Church Politic of Silence and Homophobia. And it reads this: why can't we as an African American community tell the truth about our sexuality? What price do we pay in telling the truth? And what role does the church play in perpetuating unsafe sexual behavior? Homophobia in the African American community has become more than merely a spiritual crisis. It is now a public health crisis. Of course, airing the problem publicly will be viewed by many in the black community as airing our dirty laundry or putting our business in the street. But when 42% of the country's homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, and approximately 90% within this group is comprised of African American and Latino youth from urban enclaves in New York City, Boston, Los Angeles, the problem is already on the street. Why? Because our kids are. Their sexual orientation and gender expressions do not make these youth children of a lesser God, and they deserve better than to be made homeless. But the church has been both unapologetically and unabashedly closing its door to this group of kids. The transmission of HIV and AIDS in the Black community is another problem that we have that the church needs to deal with. But sexuality has never been a comfortable topic of discussion in the African American church. Let me say a few reasons why. This is largely due to slavery, and then what we, as African Americans, appropriated from the dominant culture about sexual behavior in order to deem ourselves as human beings in the eyes of our oppressor. First bred as cattle during slavery and later taught out as sex sirens and then taunted as sex predators. Black sexuality has never had a chance to evolve in an environment free of abuse, free of violence, and free of stereotypes. The raping of Black women and the lynching of Black men in this country by white men have always kept the control of Black bodies away from us. In carving out a racial identity, we, African Americans, have done it at the expense of leaving our bodies and our sexuality behind. And with the embrace of fundamentalist Christianity that has bedded in its tenets an asexual theology, bodies and sexualities that were once systematically usurped by white slave masters are now ritualistically harnessed by the Black church with a politic of silence, viewed as a revolutionary act against a white oppressive gaze. But what happens in churches, in communities, and families when people lose touch of their bodies and their sexualities? That is the question that we're struggling with in the African American community. And one of the things that I have no time. Oh, Jesus, okay. Okay. One of the things that we're trying to grapple with here, particularly in light of this new incident with Bishop Eddie Long, is that we need to have a conversation about human sexuality, that Black sexuality falls within that rubric of human sexuality. And the only way that we can save our youth is first to save and educate our adults. That, believe it or not, that is a topic that is not talked about much in the Black church. And the Black church is the only place it can begin to emerge from, because the Black church functions as a multiple site. Because of segregation, and even today, because of racism, the Black church is where you go get your politics, your education, you learn stuff about what's going on in society, and you also go there for spiritual fulfillment. But we have to begin to educate our Black parishioners. And one way that we can do it, I know we got 0 minutes left here, is that what we have to do, one of the things that we know about the Black church, as I think is pretty similar in many churches, that women are the backbone of the churches. We have to empower those Black mothers who have children, whether they are gay or straight, on this issue. Because, see, once Black sisters move the church then moves. Thank you.
Thank you. There certainly will be an opportunity to come back to that, so. Okay.
Thank you. I was thinking as I was coming here tonight, 2 nights ago, I was in front of the State House. There was a vigil, candlelight vigil and rally to bring attention to the recent publicity around young people who had committed suicide. And I was struck by, of course, that this was largely, primarily organized by young people, by youth and young adults. A number of the speakers were members of Bagley or former members of Bagley. And so I wish that some of those young people were here on the panel, in fact, because really they are more than able to speak for themselves and are articulate in articulating their issues and their concerns. But that being said, as someone who has been working with young people for 30 years now, through Bagley and other organizations and programs, I think it's important that we reflect on the place of young people in our community and what that means, because as was mentioned earlier, so much of the community is defined by adults. Spaces for adults, 21 plus places, whether it's bars or other organizations, and there's absolutely has been, and in some ways continues to be, a fear that of adults in being associated with youth or working with youth or because of the stigma. And while that's beginning to change, certainly, we still have a long way to go, and so there's still that distrust between the generations. A little bit about Bagley. Bagley is the Boston Alliance of Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Youth. We're the oldest and largest organization specifically for queer youth in Massachusetts, and one of the oldest in the country. We were founded just after the Anita Bryant days, so in 1980, and by young people, for young people, and led by young people with support from adult staff and volunteers. We provide social support programming, health promotion programming, community organizing activities, youth leadership development. And Bagley also coordinates a statewide GLBT youth group network of Massachusetts. So there's a network of 15 community-based groups similar to Bagley across the state, and we serve as convener and coordinator and also provide some funding to support their work. So again, in reflecting tonight, I've had a really rare opportunity and privilege, and I really mean that. I say that a lot when I do public speaking. It has been my great privilege and opportunity to have been able to work with young people, self-identified, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, many other labels and identities that we're not mentioning tonight, every week of every month of every year for over 30 years now. And so I remember the 1980s when the great majority of young people coming to Bagley had never met or knowingly met someone who identified in the way that they do, and that fear of stepping into a space for the first time, and the only thing that they had in their heads was stereotypes of what they might encounter, their fears of what they might encounter when they were meeting other young people like themselves. That began to change in the 90s as there was increased attention paid to queer youth issues, and the beginning of real organizing both in the schools and the communities and through state government. And then the last decade has been really a retrenchment. We've lost a lot. We've lost funding. We certainly in this state, we had, before the present governor, we had a very conservative governor who was getting more conservative by the minute as he was preparing to run for national office. And certainly 8 years of the former president and his administration that rolled back a lot of the gains in funding and programs and services for queer youth, not only here in Massachusetts, but across the country. And so we've never had a system in the state that fully supports young people in the way that they need and deserve. And what we did have has been cut back significantly. So as we're coming together as a community to think about ways that we can support our community's young people, and as we particularly focus on the issue of religion. I'd like to tell you a story. This was reminding me, I was going back 30 years to our very first year of Bagley, and there was a young person who came to the group. He was 16, and he came for a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then he stopped coming. And we didn't know, again, this is long before internets and cell phone and all the other means of communication, Facebook and so forth. We just knew that he wasn't coming to the meetings anymore. And then we heard through one of his friends who went to the school that he did, who also came to Bagley, that his parents had found out that he was gay, and his parents were strict Roman Catholic, thought that this was a sin, thought that they had done something wrong, but had grounded him. And it wasn't until he got a call, he managed to get to a payphone when he was at the library studying, that he was able to call his friend, who was in turn able to tell us what happened. So fast forward a couple of years, because certainly, a little bit of time, eventually he wasn't grounded anymore, and he was able to come back to Bagley, even though he was not obviously telling his parents where he was going. But it was a couple of years later that Bagley had invited its speakers from PFLAG, and we had just called up PFLAG asking for some parents to come in to speak to the group, as we had done regularly over the years. And in through the door walked two parents, a couple. I didn't recognize them because I had never met them, but in fact, they were the parents of this young person, and they had, particularly through his mother, this young person's mother had found PFLAG and had been able to find support from other parents, and ultimately in their case, rejecting a religion that rejected their son, and they chose their son. And so I feel like it's so important to acknowledge that young people need support through organizations like Bagley, parents need support through organizations like PFLAG, and together families are often able to work through the challenges of living in a society that does not support difference, in fact, does not value difference. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about, I was thinking also in terms of personal experience, when Pam was mentioning about Farrah Fawcett, and of course I thought, well, my favorite was actually Jacqueline Smith, although in my case, I didn't want to be with her, I wanted to be her. And so I think a reminder as we talk about sexual orientation in gay, lesbian, and bisexual people that in fact transgender youth and adults are among the most marginalized of our community, still lacking the basic legal protections that, especially in this state, are afforded those based on sexual orientation, and that disproportionately, even more than the suicide rate, is the murder rate of young transgender people, especially young trans people of color. Bagley's focus for some years now has been on the interlocking and intersecting and overlapping communities of youth of color, transgender youth, and youth from low-income backgrounds, because multiple oppression, as we know, is what any oppression is challenging, but when young people are facing multiple oppressions in our society, then they are at most at risk. So I guess I would just say around, since the focus of this panel discussion is around religion and spirituality, working with young people for 30 years, we have had young people from all religious traditions or spiritual traditions and none, young people who have very painfully struggled with being different in a faith that they very much want to remain part of, but that has been rejecting. Others for whom they chose to reject the faith and either find another spiritual tradition that is more affirming or none. And young people who have been fortunate to grow up where in spiritual traditions that from the beginning have been more affirming. What we do know is that no matter how you identify and how you were raised, we live in a culture that where spirituality and structured religious experiences are valued and part of our lives. As I said, I was raised very liberal, Protestant, congregational. We didn't talk about sin or hell or any of those things. I never grew up thinking that there was something that was bad, that how I identified was bad. But I was certainly aware that there were many traditions that did. And I think that we need to remember that's part of society, no matter how we are raised. So I know we're out of time, but thank you.
You're having a time with that, aren't you?
Well, I'm going to overcome one way or the other. Well, Grace, I'm particularly grateful that I got to follow you. You've set me up beautifully. We didn't anticipate this at all. I was thinking in answer to the three sort of lessons that Mark gave us in his speech tonight. We had the benefit of the speech ahead of time to think about it a little bit, about a few things. And what came to mind for me is the prophet Joel's prophecy about the new age that's coming, that we're promised is going to be better than the one that we're in right now. And one of the ways that it's characterized is that there will be dreaming by old people in it, but there'll be a lot more prophecy and visions from young people in it. And what I want to say to you tonight is that it is in fact now, in this moment in time, your time. We simply cannot wait on you to grow older or wiser. The world will not wait. Our children are jumping off of bridges. So don't wait on us. We've done all we can. We did a good job. It was hard. And I could spend an hour or two recounting history to you, but you wouldn't listen to it, and it doesn't matter. Just take it from me, it was hard. There was HIV, there was oppression, we didn't have any language, it was hard. When I went to be the student pastor at Uvalde, Georgia in the Methodist Church about 1985, I had a family full of boys that loved to come to the parsonage and just hang out with me, and one of them's name was Albert. And Albert's daddy, every Sunday afternoon after church, would harangue his family with how bad it was that that preacher was letting that fag play the piano up in the front of the church. And I had been gone from that church about 6 weeks when Albert hanged himself in the barn. And Irene, you and I know what was happening in Albert's heart. I didn't have any vocabulary. I would hand people, there were 2 out gay families in that little church, 90 members, wide spot in the road, little country town. I would hand them Virginia Mollencott's book and run just as fast as I could from the conversation, because I was a United Methodist. I wasn't allowed to have that conversation. But we found some vocabulary, we have learned some things, but friends, you must not wait on us anymore. Because what God is saying to you now, just as God was speaking to us in those days, and we found vocabulary for it, what God is saying to you today is the very thing that needs to be said. Don't wait on us. We are waiting, listening, begging for your vision, for your prophecy. We have done what we can to try to set you up. There are resources available for the conversations that must be had, and they must be had in local communities. Use out in Scripture from our website at hrc.org, Human Rights Campaign, hrc.org. Go there. Use it devotionally. Do what the young woman did in New Orleans. She ran up to me and hugged my neck at a party, and she said, "You're that guy." I said, "Well, I bet I am." What did I do? She said, that thing, I print that thing off every Saturday night, and my girlfriends and I use it for Bible study. And she described to me how in that post-Katrina world in New Orleans, they didn't have the luxury of going to find a gay-affirming church. They just didn't. Their churches needed them. Their families needed them to be in place where they were. But they were being beaten up every Sunday when they went to church. There was something anti-gay every single day. So they would get together on Saturday night, study out in Scripture together. They created their own community, and they steeled themselves against the experience that they were going to have on Sunday morning, but they were able to go into it equipped. Those things are out there. We now have resources on our website around gender identity in your faith communities. We have a companion to the movie For the Bible Tells Me So. Friends, go get them and use them. They're free of charge, and you don't need permission. You can be the speaker for the evening. You don't have to have no hair or gray hair. What do you do to that hair, girl? To be the speaker.
I'm happy to say that I'm happy to be nappy.
Thank you, baby. Happy to be nappy. You do not have to wait on us to come to your town. You go be the speaker. And I beg you to be the speaker, because it's your story that's going to really matter more than anything else. Those resources are there, and if you've got a community that's wrestling with this, go to my colleagues at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force's website and find out all the things at the Institute for Welcoming Resources about how to make your congregation welcoming and affirming. No matter what denomination you come from, what background or tradition you are, it's there for you. Just as Dell and Phyllis had to insert women into the conversation in 1964, you young people are going to have to insert your bodies into the conversation now. Again, don't wait on us. It's not that we're not dreaming, we old people. It's that we've grown dreaming. We have been through so much that we think we know how to do things. The problem is, the things to be done are now to be done among your generation. And we don't have all the vocabulary for that. So you have got to insert your bodies into that conversation physically and literally in your voices, because without you, we will continue to go down paths that have worn thin. The great beauty of Mark's historical work around Anita Bryant is that a woman who most of you really don't know much about is being exposed yet again. But when you read it, you're going to recognize her. You're just going to put different people's faces in your mind, because it's the same old story coming from the right wing. We must have a new story, a different story, and it's yours to deliver to us. And finally, I want you to take heart in the fact that some of us old folks have actually had some success. Things are, in fact, better today than they were when I was at Uvalde, Georgia in 1985 and 86. This week, Boyd Packer, 89-year-old president of the Quorum of the 12 of the LDS Church, chose this environment of people committing suicide right and left around him to say yet again that being gay was sinful, was intrinsically evil, was against God's nature, God's plan for the world, and that you must go through, if you're LGBT, discredited reparative therapies that will harm you more than they will help you. It's been proven by science. Next Tuesday, we are going to present more than 100,000 petitions signed by Americans to Boyd K. Packer, who cared enough about you and your generation to stand up for you. And we're going to take with us the Mormon psychiatrist from Salt Lake City who wrote the American Psychiatric Association's white paper on why reparative therapy is harmful. That's change. And I'm not going to tell you it's enough. I'm not going to tell you I'm proud of what we've done. I've only had 50 years at it. I'm almost done. I have almost run my race. I have almost run my race. I beg you, friends, get up and start running yourself. We need you.
All right.